And it turns out we can do even better by adding interactivity to this too. But to do that, we're going to need one final language for today. And this one is an actual programming language. And we won't use it all that much in CS50, but we introduce it here as we begin web stuff because there's just so many free libraries and professional libraries that you can use just to make your web applications fancier and more interactive. Mobile applications as well increasingly use HTML, CSS, and JavaScript to power our iPhones and Android devices as well. So a quick tour of some syntax, and then we'll conclude with just some hopefully inspiring examples to give you a taste of what JavaScript can do. So JavaScript supports conditionals, just like C and Python before it. If we rewind to our Scratch days, here, of course, is a conditional. Here is the corresponding JavaScript code as of today. It's pretty much identical to C with the syntax here. If we had an if-else, in Scratch it looked like this. In JavaScript, it's going to look like this instead. So it's a bit of a regression vis-a-vis Python. Like the parentheses are back, the curly braces are back, the semicolons I mentioned in CSS are also back in JavaScript potentially. But it's familiar is the point here. And it's a different language that's frequently used for the web, whereas you can't use Python in the ways we're about to use JavaScript. It just wasn't designed for that purpose. Meanwhile, if you have an if, else in Scratch, well, in JavaScript, just like in C, it's going to look like this instead. Variables in JavaScript, of course, are a thing too. And in Scratch, we might have initialized a counter variable to 0. In JavaScript, a few different ways to do this. And just for now, the keyword is let. It's sort of a polite way of asking for a variable. Let counter equals 0, semicolon. So you don't mention the type, but you do use a keyword here, in this case called let. If you want to increment counter by 1, few different ways. In JavaScript, you can do this, just like in C. In JavaScript, you can do this, just like in C and in Python. In JavaScript, you can also get this. So ++ is back. So maybe that counterbalances the other syntax as well. That was not the case in Python. Loops are back, of course, in JavaScript, whereas in Scratch, you could repeat 3 times like this. In JavaScript, it's pretty much just like C. The only difference here is that you say let instead of int for an example like this. Meanwhile, if you want to do something forever in Scratch, in JavaScript, just like in C, you say while true in this case. So this is to say, we're sort of comfortable spending relatively little time on JavaScript, at least for today's purposes, because syntactically, it's really the same as we've seen before, with maybe a slight variance here or there. But what's interesting today, arguably, is just what kinds of things you can do with it. So with that said, what kinds of things can we do? It all comes back to this picture. If this is a simple web page on the left, and this is the corresponding tree, or DOM, document object model, on the right, that is the tree the browser automatically creates in memory, or RAM, for you, JavaScript is now a proper programming language that lets us dynamically manipulate, like read data from this, change this. And this is how Google, for instance, implements your inbox. They might have in your inbox, it's like a table. So tr, 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 probably, something like that. Or heck, maybe div, 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 div. Using JavaScript, anytime they realize someone sent you new mail, they can create a new node, a new rectangle in memory. And you, the human, see a new div or a new tr again and again and again. So with JavaScript, you just have the ability to control the user's experience instead of, like I've been doing, constantly hitting reload in the page to see some new content. To see some new content, JavaScript can be running 24/7 so that you can actually see all of these changes live. So with that said, let me go ahead and tease just some of these features. And let me open up, for instance, something like this. Let me go over to VS Code in just a moment here. And let me open in advance some programs I wrote. And give me just a moment to open these up. I'm going to go ahead and grab from today's source 8 directory all of today's examples. And I'm going to go ahead first and open up a file called background.html. But first, let's take a look at it in the browser. So here, within my browser, I have a new source 8 directory, which has all of today's examples, but this time pre-made. In my source 8 directory, I'm going to scroll down and open up background.html. And this is a very simple example. If I zoom in here, and Chrome still thinks we're in Arabic instead of English here. And here, I can click on R or G or B to achieve this. R, G, B. So relatively simple, and I could have chosen any colors, but what's happening? Well, these are 3 buttons on the screen, just like Yale had a button in the top right-hand corner for its menu. I've given them labels, R, G, and B, but I've also written some code that, quote unquote, listens for certain events. It turns out that JavaScript is really powerful when you use it to listen for user events, things that are happening behind the scenes. And this is just a non-exhaustive list, but you and I are interacting with web apps and mobile apps all the time, touching and dragging and pinching and clicking, and any number of other events are constantly happening. If you think back to week 0 in Scratch, there were a lot of events then. Like when green flag clicked was the very first event we first saw. So this is to say, in JavaScript, I can write code that listens for these various events. And from there, the entire web and every app and website you've ever seen can be implemented. So let's just take a quick glance at this code just to scratch the surface of how this now works. If I hide my terminal window and focus on background.html, you'll notice at the top of the body are just 3 buttons. But I've given those buttons an ID attribute, just so I have a way in code to uniquely identify them. And I called them red, green, and blue, respectively. But I could have called it foobar baz or XYZ. That's entirely up to me. Now, this code is going to sort of escalate quickly. But let's consider what JavaScript can do on the surface. This line of code here, 13, gives me a variable on the left called body, though I could call the variable anything I want. On the right, JavaScript, in the context of a browser, gives me a special variable called document, which refers to the whole document, the whole website, the sort of oval in the tree that I showed earlier. And it comes with a function called query selector. And query selector lets you use CSS-like syntax to select specific nodes in the tree, specific HTML tags to then manipulate. So what this is saying is, hey, browser, select the tag called body, and store that, or a pointer, if you will, though it's not technically a pointer, a reference to the body node in that tree, in the computer's memory here. And now this gets a little crazy fast, but document.querySelector, quote unquote, hash red. The hash sign is weirdly, but conventionally, the symbol you use when you want to refer to the unique ID of something. And it's just because, not a hashtag, it's a unique identifier here. So hash red is referring specifically to the HTML tag that had an ID of quote unquote red. And confusingly, there's no hash here, but there is one here just because. Now, there's another function in JavaScript where, kind of like Scratch, when green flag clicked was the verbiage there, you can add an event listener. Well, what does that mean? You can listen for an event like click, and whenever that event happens, you can call the following function. What does that function do? It does one line of code. And this is now the intersection of everything today. Using JavaScript, you can access HTML elements in memory, and you can change their CSS programmatically on the fly. So this is saying go to the body, change its style to have a background color of quote unquote red. And the other lines of code are the same for green and blue. One thing to point out, recall that everything before in CSS had hyphens. So it was font dash size, and it was text dash align. Technically in CSS we didn't use it, but it's background dash color. Unfortunately, when CSS was invented, they didn't really anticipate, presumably, using JavaScript in this way, and they couldn't do background dash color here. Why? Because it would look like background minus color. So sort of painted ourselves into a corner there. So you use this so-called camel case. If it's something dash something in CSS, it's something capitalized something else in JavaScript. Sort of stupid but simple convention. So this is why now clicking on those 3 buttons achieves that visual result of changing the body of the page from red to green to blue by listening constantly for those particular events. What else can we do? Well, let's open up another example that was a thing back in my day when I first learned HTML. Back in my day, late 1990s, the world was infatuated with an HTML tag called blink. Open bracket, blink, close bracket. And anything inside of that tag would literally blink like this. The web was hideous in the late 1990s and took a while. And MySpace didn't help things early on, if you've heard of that, where that too allowed people to control their own CSS even. And web has been ugly for some time. But this was one of the few tags that was ever removed from the HTML language because it was just this hideous. There was also another one, as an aside, called marquee, like outside a theater, where the text would just scroll across your home page greeting people. I mean, it was an ugly time. But with JavaScript, just because, we can bring back this tag. Now, just to give you a sense of how you might do this, let me open up in VS Code here in this source 8 directory, blink.html. And this is all pre-written. But here, let me call your attention to this function. JavaScript in the browser has a function called setInterval that lets you run another function every 500 milliseconds or 1,000 milliseconds, however frequently or infrequently you want, essentially an infinite loop using the clock. And then up here, what's this blink function I wrote? Well, I again use a variable to get the page's body. And then I do this. And this is another example of like left hand clearly not talking very well to right hand. The opposite of visible in CSS is not invisible, it's hidden. So here we have some JavaScript code that says if the body's style has a visibility of hidden, change it to visible. Otherwise, change it to hidden. So essentially, change it back and forth every time this function is called. And if, per line 22 here, you call that function every half a second, every 500 milliseconds, it's going to blink the tag again and again. And if we change this to be like maybe every 50 milliseconds, go back here and reload the page, now you'll see the text is really blinking all the more quickly. So not useful, but again, just hints at what you can do that's kind of bringing us back to our world of Scratch where you might have constantly be listening for events. How about two final examples here? If I go into VS Code again, and let me close those two tabs and open up, how about, say, Autocomplete.html? This is a feature of the web that is everywhere. Let me go back to our index here, open Autocomplete.html, and let me start typing for C-A-T, and there's cat. Now, where are all of these unordered list items coming from? Well, I went back to problem set 5, where we had a really big dictionary of words, like 130,000 plus words, loaded them into my JavaScript code, and I wrote some code that listens for key presses, or the user's finger going up from the keyboard. And every time the user types in a letter, I quickly search that whole big text file of words, looking for ones that start with whatever the user typed in. So this is my own sort of version of Google or Bing or any application that auto-completes. It's just an event listener listening for user input, searching, and then updating dynamically some HTML code. And now last but not least, and I'm always holding my breath with this one because it doesn't always work, let me go into a final example called Geolocation.html. And this too is in source 8, geolocation, and it's relatively short, but also suggests the power of today's websites and mobile apps. If you've ever ordered something online or used Google Maps or the like, your phone, your laptop can find you in the world with high probability on a map. It turns out that built into browsers today via JavaScript is another special variable globally called navigator. So we saw document, we saw window, and now we see navigator. And navigator has a geolocation child, if you will, with a getCurrentPosition function that if you write a bit more code can allow you to figure out the user's own latitude and longitude. So crossing my fingers big time for this, let me go back to our other tab, open up Geolocation.html. I'm getting a prompt at top left for privacy's sake that the website wants to know my location. I'm going to allow it. I'm going to now, oh my God, location's turned off. Hang on, let me see if I can fix this real fast. Otherwise, this will be really underwhelming. Come on, let's see. Does this work? Yes. Google Chrome, enable location services. All right, let's reload the page. Please work. OK. According to Google, I am right this moment with my Mac at latitude, longitude 42.375, comma, negative 71.11. Let's go ahead and highlight and copy that. Let's go to a website like googlemaps.com, crossing our fingers. If you've never done this, you can search for GPS coordinates too. Let's hit enter, and amazing. We are indeed in Sanders Theater, roughly there, standing on this stage on Halloween. And that then is week 8. We will see you next time. Happy Halloween.
اللهم صل وسلم وبارك على محمد وعلى آل محمد رسولنا النبي الأمي المبعوث رحمة للعالمين خاتم الأنبياء والمرسلين نور هذه الأمة وضياؤها وشفيعنا يوم الحساب